It's always the quiet ones you have to watch out for, they say. But if I'm being honest, I don't think it was the kid's silence that unsettled me. It was his eyes, too calculating for an 18-year-old, too aware. Even when he smiled, there was something in his gaze that felt off, like he was playing a game, and I was the last to know the rules. I tried to tune it out, the whir of my headphones cutting through the noise, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the muffled sounds of my wife's voice drifting down the hallway from the living room. She was teaching him again, explaining the same problem she'd been hammering into his skull for the past 5 days. "No, Sam, you're missing a step there. Focus," she'd say in that soft, patient tone of hers, like she had all the time in the world. It wasn't like me to complain about her work. Hell, I'd always supported her ambitions. I admired her for them. But this felt different. 5 days ago, I'd never have imagined things would come to this. The argument we'd had over this kid coming into our home, it had been ugly. I told her I didn't want strangers from her school in our house. I didn't know this kid, and I didn't trust him. I'd raised my voice, and she'd raised hers. It was the kind of fight where nothing was resolved, only buried, until the next inevitable blow-up. But she kept begging, insisting that Sam needed this, that he had potential, that with the right help, he could be one of the brightest students she'd ever mentored. And in the end, I caved. "Please, just this once," she'd said, her eyes wide, pleading. I'd been too tired to argue anymore, too worn down from the same cycle of promises and disappointments that defined our marriage. So, I agreed, but I never expected it to be like this. Now, 5 days later, it felt like I was living in a slow-burning nightmare. Each day, the same routine. She would let him in at exactly 4 in the afternoon, her voice rising with every hour they spent together. The endless explanations, the scribbled notes, the charts and equations all piled up, the desperation in her tone as she struggled to break through his confusion. It all built up into this unbearable crescendo of noise, her voice echoing through our home like it was the only sound in the world. Sometimes, I couldn't help but wonder if she was doing it on purpose, drawing out the lessons, stretching them past the point of reasonable explanation, as if she wanted me to leave, as if she wanted to force me to go out for a walk, to get away from the house, to let her and Sam have their time together in peace. The idea gnawed at me, and that's when I started noticing it. It wasn't just the volume of her voice. It was the way she'd look at him when she thought I wasn't watching. That soft, almost imperceptible smile she gave him when he finally got a problem right. The way she'd touch his arm lightly when she leaned over to point at something on the page. It was subtle, but I saw it. I couldn't unsee it. I had this gut feeling, this gnawing sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't the fact that he was young or that he was a student. Hell, I'm sure she'd mentored plenty of young men and women before. But this one felt different. It was as if he was in control, as if he knew exactly what buttons to press to get under my skin. I'd catch his glances when I walked by the living room, and I swear, he wasn't just looking at me like a stranger. He was studying me, like he was measuring me up, figuring out my weaknesses, figuring out how to manipulate me. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was imagining things. But I had this feeling deep in my gut, this pull of unease, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it kept growing. It was only after the 5th day, when I had come back from one of my long, aimless walks, that I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, watching the scene unfold from the hallway. She was sitting on the couch, leaning towards Sam, her voice too soft now to catch every word, but I knew what was happening. I saw the way her fingers brushed the back of his hand when he reached for a pencil. Saw the way his eyes lingered just a second too long on her face. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, like I was the one who didn't belong here. I could have walked in, could have called it out, demanded to know what was going on. But instead, I stayed in the doorway, my hand on the frame, feeling something inside me start to twist. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe it was the sound of her voice rising just a little bit too much again, the edge in her tone that I knew so well. Maybe it was the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something intimate about the way they interacted. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. And I wasn't sure if I was angry at her, at Sam, or at myself. I should have said something. I should have walked in and asked her why she needed him around like this. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and I walked out of the house, as if I had been the one to need a break. But that's the thing, right? The longer you ignore it, the more it festers. The more you let it grow, the more you lose control of the narrative. And what started as a small feeling of discomfort was already starting to turn into something bigger, something darker. And I was only just beginning to realize that this wasn't just about math anymore. The door clicked shut behind me as I stood in the hallway, the silence of the house suddenly louder than it had ever been before. For a second, I wondered if I had made the wrong choice by walking away. What did I think I was accomplishing by stepping outside? It wasn't like I could escape the growing knot in my stomach, that feeling that something was wrong. Something was shifting in the very air of our home. I turned around, just as the doorbell rang faintly in the distance. Why should I run away from my own house when they're both here? I muttered to myself. I didn't have an answer. The thought of retreating to the anonymity of the street, of losing myself in the crowds, made less and less sense. Instead, I took a deep breath, tightening the strap of my jacket, and walked back toward the front door. Something in me needed to confront whatever was happening, even if I didn't have the words for it. When I walked through the door, the atmosphere shifted immediately. There was something thick in the air, something that felt like it had been disturbed. It was just an instinct I had, something you couldn't quite touch but could always feel. I froze for a second in the doorway. The first thing I noticed was him, the kid, Sam. He was already pulling his jacket on, one arm through the sleeve, but he paused when he saw me. His gaze flickered quickly toward my wife, like there was some silent cue passed between them, and then he finished buttoning up his coat. "Hey," he said casually with a nod of his head, but it wasn't the casualness of a student who'd just been tutored. No, this was the kind of casualness a guy used when he was trying to hide something. I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I stood there in the doorway, my eyes scanning the living room. My wife was standing near the kitchen, a towel draped over her shoulder, but her face was pale, like she had just seen a ghost. Her eyes were wide, not in the excited way they normally were when she was talking about her work, but in a way that made her look cornered, like she'd been caught doing something she didn't want anyone to see. I don't know why, but I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was the shock of seeing Sam leaving so abruptly. Or maybe it was the fact that I didn't want to confront her, to call out something I wasn't ready to admit. So instead, I gave the most neutral response I could muster. "Did you just go inside?" she asked, her voice tight, forced, like she was trying to steer the conversation away from whatever had just happened. She glanced between Sam and me, and I saw her hands clench the towel in a nervous gesture. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Yes," I said. "I did." And then, as if to justify the decision, I added, "I remembered I needed to close the garage." It was a flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. But it didn't matter. In that moment, I couldn't bring myself to say what I was really thinking. I didn't mention what I had seen, how Sam had been dressing in such a hurry, how he hadn't even bothered to look me in the eye before bolting for the door. I didn't mention the way my wife had stiffened when I came in, how everything in the room had felt too tense. Instead, I just stood there, feeling like the air in the house had been thickened by something I couldn't fully name. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean for it to run this late. He needed the extra time." Her voice faltered at the end, as if she was apologizing for more than just the hours. I didn't respond. What was there to say? She was lying, and I knew it. I felt the lies settling in the pit of my stomach, a weight that wouldn't let go. She was lying about something, about Sam, about the time, about why I'd had to walk in on their little session. But I didn't say anything. I just turned, walked toward the stairs, and told her I was going to bed. The moment I stepped into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, I felt the familiar emptiness of the space swallow me whole. It wasn't like any other night. Not like the nights where the quiet felt peaceful or the comfort of the bed made me forget the noise of the world. No, tonight, the silence felt heavier. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. What had just happened? What had I really seen? I couldn't stop thinking about the way she looked at him when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his eyes never left her. The way they spoke to each other without words. I caught it before, a glance, a touch, a small shift in the air. But tonight it was different. It was sharper. It was undeniable. The bed felt cold next to me, and I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The sound of Sam's voice still lingered in the corners of my mind, the quiet way he said goodbye to my wife, the way she smiled back at him. It was all too much, too many little details coming together into something I didn't want to face. But I knew. Deep down, I knew something had shifted. Something was happening, and I was starting to understand that it was bigger than just a few extra hours spent tutoring a student. But what was I supposed to do with that feeling? What was I supposed to do with the fact that, for the first time, I felt like an outsider in my own home? I lay there in the dark, my mind spinning, and all I could think about was how I had been right to feel uneasy. Because once you see the cracks, they don't just disappear. And from now on, everything I looked at would be through a lens of suspicion. I couldn't sleep at all. The hours dragged on like the endless ticking of a clock, but it wasn't the time that kept me awake. It was the noise in my head. The images, the feelings, the way she looked at him, the way he looked at her. The whole thing had crawled under my skin, burrowing itself deeper and deeper, until I couldn't shake it, couldn't think of anything else. I turned over, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. What the hell am I supposed to do? I kept asking myself. It wasn't just about what I had seen, it was about what I hadn't seen. There was a gap, a space between what I suspected and what I knew. I wasn't stupid. I could feel it. The distance between us had grown wider than I'd ever realized. But confronting her now? That wouldn't work. If I walked up to her and demanded an explanation, she'd deny everything. She was too smart for that. She'd play the victim. She'd make it all about how misunderstood she was, how she never meant to hurt me. And I'd look like the fool. I could already hear her voice in my head, calm and collected, explaining away every doubt, every moment I'd caught her, justifying it until I believed her again. No, not this time. I had to catch her red-handed. It had to be undeniable. I spent hours lying there, plotting my next move. What would give me the leverage I needed? What would break through that wall she'd built up so carefully over the years? That's when it came to me. I had to make it so she wouldn't know I was watching. I had to make her think I was out of the house. Give her the freedom she thought she needed. I could feel my pulse quicken as the plan took shape in my mind. It wasn't much, just a few small details I could control, but it was enough. The next morning, I barely said a word to her as she moved around the kitchen. Saturday. She didn't have to work today, and I could feel her relief as she made coffee, humming under her breath like nothing was wrong. She was so comfortable, so sure of herself. Around 10 a.m., she came into the living room, the sound of her slippers on the floor breaking the silence. She glanced at me, her smile tired but warm, as if she hadn't just been caught in a lie a day ago. At noon, she said with that same calm tone, "Sam will be here for another session." Just like we agreed, I nodded, my pulse steady, keeping my face neutral. "Okay," I said, trying to sound casual, like I didn't have a plan brewing in my head. "I'll be around." It was exactly what I needed. She had just confirmed my window. I was getting the confirmation I needed without her even realizing it. The clock ticked by, each minute passing like a drumbeat in my chest. The time was coming. At noon, she'd be distracted, tuning into the rhythm of their tutoring, the constant flow of equations and numbers. She wouldn't even think twice about it. By 12 p.m., I'd already made my decision. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed my jacket off the back of the chair, and said it without looking her in the eye. "I'm going to see Brian. I need to deliver the tools I borrowed from him." It was the perfect excuse. No one questioned a man dropping by a friend's house on a Saturday afternoon. Not to mention, I'd given myself a window. Enough time for her to settle in with Sam. Enough time for whatever was going to happen next. "I'll be back by 2 or 3, I added as casually as I could. It didn't matter that it was a little earlier than usual, or that I didn't usually take such a long trip to Brian's. I had already made my decision, and I wasn't going to second-guess myself now. "Okay," she said, her voice slightly distracted as she adjusted the hem of her blouse. "Be careful, okay?" There was something in the way she said it, that tightness in her voice, that made me pause for just a fraction of a second. Was it guilt? Fear? Or was I just imagining it? But I didn't let myself linger. I turned on my heel and headed toward the door, not giving her another glance. She had already forgotten about me, already turning her focus to Sam, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was the one in control. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cold air as I got into the car. The engine roared to life beneath my fingers, but even as I pulled away from the driveway, my mind was still back at the house. I could already picture what was happening inside. Her setting everything up, making sure Sam was comfortable. Maybe even feeling that same rush of excitement I had felt when she asked me to step aside so they could have their private time together. But now I had something she didn't. I knew I was close. I could feel it. This wasn't just about catching her in a lie anymore. This was about proving to myself that I wasn't crazy, that my gut instinct had been right all along. I was going to see what happened when she thought I was gone. I didn't know what I was going to find when I got back. I didn't know what would happen once I had my proof. But that was the point, wasn't it? To catch her, to finally know, and to make her see that I wasn't the one who had been blind. The air outside felt colder than it should have been, a sharp contrast to the warmth in my car. My eyes were fixed on the house. That house, the one I'd spent years building with her, the one that now felt like a prison. I kept my hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, the engine idling softly beneath me, a quiet hum that felt like a countdown. I had parked a few blocks down, hidden just out of view from the front door, but close enough to watch, to see. It wasn't even noon yet, and already I could feel the weight of the minutes stretching out like they might never end. I tried to stay calm. I tried to tell myself that this wasn't about paranoia, that I wasn't just jumping to conclusions. I was doing the right thing. I was going to catch them. And then, just like that, the gate swung open. There he was, Sam. He walked up to the front door with the same quiet confidence he'd had every other day. The same nonchalant stride that always made my skin crawl. He didn't knock, didn't hesitate, just stepped right inside like he belonged. Like it was his house. I leaned back in my seat, watching him disappear behind the door, the sound of the gate clicking shut behind him. My stomach twisted, but I didn't move. I had to stay calm. I had to stay sharp. The next few minutes were crucial. And then my phone rang. I jumped. For a split second, I thought my heart had stopped. My entire body froze. Oh shit, I thought. Did she know? I quickly glanced at the caller ID. It was her. I almost didn't answer it, almost let it go to voicemail, but something stopped me. Maybe I wanted to hear her voice, to see if she'd say something that might give me a clue. Maybe I thought if I answered it, I could control the conversation. Either way, I swiped the screen, and before I could even say anything, her voice came through, too casual, too sweet. "Hey, are you at Brian's yet?" she asked. I swallowed hard, the panic still fresh in my chest. "No, not yet," I said, forcing the words out like they weren't an immediate lie. "I'm just getting there now." I could hear the rustling of something in the background, probably the sound of her preparing for whatever it was they were about to do. But she didn't pause. She didn't give any sign that anything was out of place. "Well, when you're heading back, can you stop by the store? I need some minced meat for dinner." She said it like it was the most normal thing in the world, like nothing was wrong. "Call me when you're on your way back, and I'll tell you which kind." I could feel my blood boil. It wasn't the request. It wasn't the fact that she wanted minced meat. I had done that kind of thing 100 times before. No, it was the timing, the way she was trying to track my movements. When I was heading back, how long I would be gone. She wanted to know exactly when I was coming home, and that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just a casual request. She wanted to know when I'd be walking through the door. She wanted to know if I was actually going to be at Brian's, or if I was pulling some kind of stunt. She was trying to keep tabs on me, trying to control the narrative before I could figure out what was going on inside that house. I wanted to throw the phone out the window. My knuckles went white from gripping it too hard, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I forced a calmness into my voice, even though everything inside me was screaming. "Okay, sure. I'll call you when I'm on my way back," I said, my words tight. "Thanks, babe," she said, and I could hear the faintest hint of relief in her voice. Like she was back in control, like she had just thrown another smokescreen over whatever was really happening. I hung up the phone, and the rage hit me like a wave. I could feel it coursing through my veins, burning hot. She had planned that. She had said those words on purpose, had calculated it, knowing exactly how to throw me off. It wasn't just a phone call. It wasn't just the casual request for minced meat. It was everything that had led up to this moment. She had been hiding things from me for days, hell, maybe longer, and now I was supposed to believe that everything was fine? That nothing was going on behind my back? I gripped the steering wheel harder, my fists clenched so tight I thought I might break something. The feeling of helplessness, of being manipulated, made me sick. How many times had I been fooled by her charm? By her softness? By the way she always had the perfect excuse? How many times had I ignored the warning signs because I didn't want to believe it? This was it, the breaking point. I stared at the house again, trying to calm my breathing. Sam was still inside. She was still inside. Everything was in motion. Everything was just as it had been before. Normal on the surface, but beneath it, it was all falling apart. I had to stay focused. I couldn't let my emotions get the best of me. I wasn't going to storm in there. I wasn't going to make a scene. I needed evidence. I needed proof. I needed to see it for myself. Then I could confront her. Then I could finally show her that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. But I couldn't stop the rage, couldn't stop the bitter taste in my mouth as I thought about everything she had hidden from me. Everything I had missed. My phone buzzed again. It was her. I knew I had to pick it up, but I was so angry, so overwhelmed by everything that had happened and everything I'd seen, I didn't think twice. My heart was hammering in my chest, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me from the car, away from the safety of distance, toward the house, toward the truth, toward whatever I was going to find. I'd spent enough time sitting there, watching from the outside, my eyes burning with the need to know. And now, the only thing left to do was see it for myself, to witness it with my own eyes. I took a slow breath, fighting the tightness in my throat, and moved toward the house. The driveway was empty now, just the faint echo of footsteps that had long since disappeared. Sam was still inside. I could feel it, and I knew she was too. I moved quietly, avoiding the front door and slipping around the side of the house. There was a small patch of yard between the walls, a sliver of space where I could hide, where no one would see me. I crept around the back, trying to keep myself out of view, then paused by the window of our bedroom. I wasn't sure why I chose this one, but something in me told me that this was where I'd get the answers I needed. I pressed my palm flat against the cool glass, my breath fogging up the window as I peered inside. The blinds were partially open, and through the narrow gap, I saw them. Her. In him. My stomach churned. There was no denying it. No pretending I hadn't seen it. She was standing close to him, so close that I could almost feel the space between them crackling with tension. Their faces were inches apart, and then my breath caught in my throat. She leaned in, slowly, deliberately, and kissed him. I was frozen, my eyes glued to the scene. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to flee, to get out of there before I saw anything else. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The kiss didn't last long, but it was enough. Too much. It was everything I had been dreading, everything I had suspected, all laid bare before me. The way her hands found his shoulders, the way he responded with a confidence that made my skin crawl. It was too intimate, too raw. They were crossing a line I hadn't wanted to see them cross. And then, as if to confirm the depth of what was happening, my wife started to remove her clothes. She did it so casually, so easily, as if she'd done this 100 times before. The soft rustle of fabric as it hit the floor was too much. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked away. But something in me wouldn't let go. I watched, helpless, as she stood there in just her underwear. I didn't want to see this. I didn't want to watch it unfold. But I had to know. I had to see it for myself. It felt like an eternity before I could force myself to move, to do something. I can't just stand here, I told myself. I need to confront her. I need to end this now. My hand went to the door. It was locked. Panic hit me like a wave. I shoved at the door, my hands trembling with frustration. I shouted her name, louder than I meant to, but the sound of my voice felt like it was coming from a distance, as if I wasn't even in control of it. I saw everything. I yelled, my throat raw. I saw what you were doing. I heard the scramble inside, her hurried movements, the sound of her voice rising in panic, then the unmistakable sounds of clothes rustling. I could hear her, could feel her fear, but I didn't care anymore. I wanted answers. I wanted the truth. Open the door, I screamed, pounding on the wood. Now! The noise inside grew louder. The sounds of frantic dressing, shoes being slapped onto the floor, a rushed attempt to restore some semblance of normalcy. I pushed harder, my fists slamming against the door. It felt like hours before I heard the lock click, but when it finally did, I shoved the door open and stormed inside. But when I entered, everything had changed. They were both dressed. Sam was standing near the window, adjusting his shirt like he hadn't just been with my wife a few minutes ago. She was already sitting at the edge of the bed, her face a mask of shock, like she had never expected me to be there. But I had seen it. I knew what had happened. The moment I stepped inside, the truth was undeniable. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected: fear. Real fear. But it wasn't the fear of getting caught. It was the fear of losing control, the fear of everything she'd built slipping through her fingers. I stood there, taking in the scene, my chest tight, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process it. Explain, I said, the word barely leaving my mouth. It wasn't a question, it was a command. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Her eyes darted to Sam, to me, then back to him again. I could see the guilt flicker across her face for just a second before she masked it with that same practiced calm. But I wasn't fooled anymore. Not after everything I had seen. And now, as I stood there, the weight of the truth settled over me like a heavy stone. I couldn't unsee what I had just witnessed. What she had done. What they had done. And nothing was ever going to be the same again. I couldn't control myself anymore. The anger, the betrayal, the shock, it all boiled over in an instant. I had stood there, watching the two of them, my wife and that kid, like some twisted scene that wasn't even real. But now that I was in the room with them, now that the truth had finally come crashing down, all I could feel was a searing rage, a heat that burned through every inch of me. I looked at her. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, what I was hearing. How could she do this to me? How could she betray everything we had built? I wanted answers, but I didn't want her excuses. I wanted to hurt her the way she had hurt me. I wanted to make her feel the devastation, the disbelief that was consuming me. Why? I shouted, my voice trembling with fury. Why did you cheat on me with this juvenile brat? I spat the words at her, at him, but mostly at her. She was the one I had trusted. She was the one I had given everything to. And now, she was standing there, completely unfazed. She didn't answer at first. Her lips quivered, but she didn't say a word. She just looked at me, eyes wide, almost guilty. No, that wasn't it. That wasn't the expression I saw in her eyes. There was something colder, something darker beneath the surface. It was like she wasn't even the woman I'd married anymore. The silence stretched on until I couldn't take it any longer. I turned my fury on Sam. What the hell is this? I shouted at him. What do you think you're doing, bringing this into my house? Who do you think you are? You little? Before I could finish, it happened. My wife's expression changed in an instant, as if something inside her snapped. She stood up, her voice rising, raw with emotion. Don't you dare yell at my future husband, she screamed at me. I froze. The words felt like a slap across my face, a sucker punch to everything I had believed. My mind couldn't process it fast enough. Her future husband? I was in shock, unable to comprehend what had just come out of her mouth. I stood there, mouth open, trying to catch my breath. What did you just say? My voice cracked as I asked, not sure if I even wanted to hear the answer. She didn't hesitate. Her eyes flashed with something I hadn't seen before. Anger, yes, but also relief. Like she'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to finally crack so she could tell me the truth. I'm tired of living with you, she yelled, each word cutting through me like a knife. I don't want an old man anymore. I want a young man. I want someone with energy, with life. Someone who actually knows how to meet my needs. The words felt like they were suffocating me. I stumbled back, as if the force of her words had physically knocked the wind out of me. She was done? After all these years, after everything we had shared, she was walking away, choosing him. Him. I felt my heart race in my chest, like it was going to burst from the pressure. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The whole room felt like it was closing in on me. "You've lost it," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "You're really doing this, aren't you? You're really throwing everything away for this kid?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, eyes blazing, her chest heaving with the intensity of her anger. I was shaking now, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts that didn't make sense. How had we gotten here? How had this all gone so wrong? I felt the rage build inside me, and it exploded out of my mouth, louder than before, and with a venom I didn't even recognize. "I'm going to ruin your life," I shouted. "You'll be a joke. Do you think people will respect you?" My wife, who's been with me for 35 years, marrying an 18-year-old kid. I could see the way she stiffened, the way her face flushed. She wasn't ashamed. No, she was defiant. "He's going to be 19 in a month," she shot back, her words laced with arrogance. As if that one detail, that 1 year, made it all better, made it somehow less ridiculous. I was barely holding it together. My chest was tight, my hands trembling, my throat burning from all the shouting. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. "You have to get out of my house," I said, my voice now cold, calculating like I'd flipped a switch. "Both of you. Now." I turned to the door, then back to them, waiting for any sign of resistance. But there was none. My wife didn't flinch. Sam didn't move. But something in me had broken. Something snapped. "Pack your things," I continued, my words slow and deliberate. "Get out. I'm not doing this. You want him? Fine. But not here. Not in my house." She opened her mouth, probably to argue, to explain herself, but I cut her off. I couldn't hear it. Not anymore. "Now. Leave." There was a long pause. No one moved. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, but there was no turning back now. Not for her. Not for me. The truth was out. And this was the end. Finally, she stood up and walked past me. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. I turned toward the door, the sound of footsteps echoing in my ears. A few minutes passed, and when I heard the sound of their departure, her footsteps, his quicker ones, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel anything. I felt empty, like the foundation of my life had just crumbled beneath me, and all that was left was dust. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, there was only silence. The kind that rings in your ears after something breaks. I stood there, staring at the door. I couldn't bring myself to move. But I knew one thing for sure. When she left, I couldn't move. Not at first. I just stood there, the weight of everything sinking into me like 1,000 pounds pressing down on my chest. The house felt different now. Hollow. Empty. The walls, once familiar and warm, now seemed like cold, indifferent strangers. I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own breath. Shallow, ragged. I had no idea how much time passed, but it felt like hours. Maybe it was just minutes. Either way, it didn't matter. I stood there, staring at the door she had just walked through, my mind replaying the last few minutes, over and over. Her words, her betrayal, her choice, her future husband. The words echoed through my head like a drumbeat, like a chant, like a poison working its way into my bones. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't process it. She had been everything to me. Everything. And now I was nothing. I slowly sank down onto the couch, the very one where we used to sit together, where we used to talk about our day, where we used to laugh. And all I could think of was how she had just walked out of that door without a second glance, without any remorse. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stop them. I didn't know what to do. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, all of it was twisting inside of me, and I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I looked around the room, as if expecting everything to come back, as if everything would reset and I could undo all of this. But nothing changed. The silence was crushing, and I could feel it closing in around me. I didn't even hear the tears when they started. They came out of nowhere, a sudden rush, like the floodgates opening after a long drought. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to feel weak. But I couldn't stop it. They came, hot and fast, and I let them. The sobs racked my body, deep, raw, ugly. I had never felt more alone. She had chosen him. I couldn't deny it anymore. I had seen it with my own eyes. Her hands on him. Her lips. She had betrayed me. And for what? For him? For an 18-year-old kid who couldn't even begin to understand what it meant to love someone, to build a life together? I was 35 years older than him, but I was the one who was left behind. I don't know how long I cried. It felt like an eternity. But after a while, something in me shifted. Something hardened. I realized I wasn't just grieving. I was empty. There was nothing left for me here anymore. No purpose. No reason to keep pretending everything was fine, that I could go on as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She was gone. And with her, the last shred of my hope, my self-respect, and the life I thought I had was gone too. I didn't care anymore. I stood up, the tears still hot on my face, but my body felt numb. My hands were still trembling, but the emotion was draining out of me, leaving nothing but a hollow ache. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my shoes, and left the house. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house, from everything that reminded me of her. The world outside felt like a foreign place. The streets were the same. The people oblivious to what had just happened to me. They went about their business, chatting, laughing, living their lives like I wasn't walking around in a daze, like I wasn't completely shattered inside. I drove without a destination, without any real thought. Just the need to keep moving, to escape the suffocating silence that had swallowed me whole. I found myself at the barracks. I don't even remember driving there. It just happened. It felt right in a way. This was where I had spent so many years before, back when life had meaning, back when I was somebody. A part of me wanted to stay there, to leave behind everything I had built with her, to leave behind this sham of a life, to disappear into the past and pretend this didn't happen. I walked through the gates, past the familiar buildings that had once been a sanctuary for me. And then I stopped. I didn't know what I was looking for. Peace? Closure? Something to fill the emptiness inside? I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at the dull, gray concrete, my mind spinning. But no matter how much I tried to force it, the truth kept slapping me in the face. She was gone. I was alone. The tears came again, though quieter this time. They were the kind of tears that don't scream. They just fall, unnoticed and unnoticed, until there's nothing left but the echo of what used to be. I walked into one of the empty rooms and sat down, my back against the wall, my hands resting in my lap. The weight of it all was too much. I wanted to forget. I wanted to escape, but there was nowhere left to run. In the end, I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know if I ever had known. And that was the hardest thing to swallow. The man I had been, the husband I had once been was gone, and nothing was going to bring him back,